You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guests today are two distinguished authors, historians. They have written a fabulous, cracking book. And the book is called Six Kings and the Making of the English State, titled Arise England. And we're going to ask about this title, Arise England, because I thought it was very fascinating. Authors are Caroline Burt and Richard Partington. Thank you so much for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast. You're not exactly down the street. You're Zooming from England, and we are very grateful.
We're really glad to be with you. Thank you. Thanks for having us.
It's our very great pleasure.
The Making of the English State. When I interview authors, I make it a point to ask them about their subtitles, because any of us who've done any writing, we put so much attention into our subtitles. Start with you, Caroline, if I may. The subtitle of the book, how did these six kings, going from 1199, starting with King John, to 1399, which is the end of Richard II's reign, after he was fortunately and judiciously kicked off the throne by my man, Henry Bolingbroke, how did these kings, these six kings, make the English state?
So that's a really good question, and I'm gonna echo your fandom of Henry Bolingbroke, who's had a really bad press historically. So yeah, good shout out. How did they make the English state? If we go all the way back to King John, bad King John, he provoked a very serious crisis in 1215, which led to the drafting of Magna Carta, which is one of the most important documents in English constitutional history, and to some extent, of course, has had a bearing on American constitutional history as well. That document essentially said, look, King, you're going to have to obey some of the same rules as the rest of us. And that essentially meant obeying the law. Because what the king had been doing is saying, oh, actually, I've got these lands in France and I want to defend them, and the French king's not very nice to me and he's fighting me, and so I'm going to need to raise an army. So I'm just going to take your property to do that. And you don't really have any choice over that, because what are you going to do, sue me? And of course, when landowners did that to each other, they really did sue each other. But suing the king was something completely different. So what Magna Carta was basically saying is, hang on a minute. If you want to take our property, you are actually going to have to abide by some rules, which is that we're going to have to consent to that. So the point then was that essentially the king was forced to think about how he found money to fight war. And fighting war costs a lot of money, and therefore he had to approach his subjects for that. He can't just find the money down the back of the sofa or something like that. That meant that there had to be a forum in which he could approach his subjects and ask for that money. And that forum became Parliament. So Parliament came into existence in the 1230s, essentially as a way in which, or a forum in which, the king could ask for the money that he could no longer take arbitrarily from people because of Magna Carta. So Parliament then, and a system of national taxation began to develop. So that's the starting point, if you like, for a lot of what we wanted to talk about. It's understanding how we go from a structure in which the king was fighting his own dynastic private wars to one in which actually the whole nation was engaged in a joint stock enterprise that was about England's lands that belonged to the Crown of England, not just the king in and of himself, that was funded, the defence of which was funded through national taxation that was agreed, discussed and agreed in Parliament. So that's one element of how all of this comes into being and why this period's so important. Don't know whether Richard wants to pick up on other things that we can talk about from 1199 to 1399.
Yeah, I think thank you, Caroline. The things I would emphasize, Robert, are Magna Carta, of course, as Caroline has said, is absolutely critical. Magna Carta is a logical corollary of the common law created before our time, before our period, that is, in 1166 by Henry II, a single legal system applicable to every free man and woman, that's the vast majority of the population, which was seized upon by ordinary people with real enthusiasm and which grew exponentially right through the 13th and the 14th centuries, which was very accessible. 95% of the cases were brought by peasants and townspeople. It was affordable and available, and increasingly available as it was modified across time. And that too developed by the successive kings, leading to Magna Carta, and then within the context of the Parliament, established as Caroline has described, discussed as a matter of national interest by the Commons and also by the Lords at times. This grew and became another critical dimension of the state. So you've got the growth of the law, you've got the emergence of Parliament and national taxation, you've got the discussion in Parliament around the needs of the realm, as Caroline has described, leading to an embracing by the entire political community of national interest. And in that debate around national interest, the law and peace and justice always loomed large. So that by the time you get to not even the end of our period to 1399, I would say certainly by the 1350s, you're in a really transformed world in which you have a genuine sense of national endeavour and national identity, which simply did not exist in 1199.
William the Conqueror came over in 1066. So from 1066 to 1199, you had some very powerful kings. My favorite king in all of English history is Henry I. He was a phenomenal leader.
Yes.
William the Conqueror, you had the anarchy. The anarchy is 1135 to 1154. You have Henry II, 1154, 1189. So you had strong kings and you had periods of strife. How much making of the English state happened in that time period, the time from the conqueror to the ascension of John I?
Really good question, Robert. And actually, if I may, I'd push us back further. Let's think about the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. James Campbell has referred to it as the Anglo-Saxon nation state. I don't think all of us would go quite that far. But in Anglo-Saxon England, so in the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, 11th centuries, you had increasingly control of coinage and the economy. You had a single administrative system run by the crown. You had royal boroughs, fortified towns where administration could take place. You had increasingly fixed and defended borders. So there were elements of what I would call the proto-state that were very strongly there. It was quite highly centralized, rich-driven. And then, of course, layered on top of that comes the Norman conquest, which adds an additional set of demands around royal control, and which starts to collect data and to account for things as part of simply getting a sense of what the new kingdom is, which is really important. Then you've got Henry I, of course, an immensely important lawgiver. And then in the aftermath of the tyranny of Stephen and Matilda, Henry II and the creation of the common law. So we wouldn't claim that 1199 to 1399 it somehow changes everything. It's part of a wider story, which of course continues after 1399 as well. But I think what we would say is that sequence in which the common law through Magna Carta begets Parliament, national taxation, genuinely communally owned foreign policy, justice policy, that these things actually did constitute a step change. That you can talk about, I think you can talk about a proto-state, you can talk about an emerging state with real confidence in the late Anglo-Saxon and the Anglo-Norman period. But I think that by the time you get to 1350, there are historians who disagree with this, particularly early modernists, but you can absolutely talk about a fully functioning state, I think, by the time you get to the mid 14th century. And that I think is the shift that we were trying to encapsulate in the title of the book and in the concept of the book, actually.
Building of a nation state, or the augmentation of a nation state, requires, and this may not be the right word, so correct me, please, acquiescence.
Yeah.
When the United States went from 13 colonies and they had the Constitutional Convention because the Articles of Confederation, states had to acquiesce. The Act of Union, 1707, isn't that right? Between England and the Great Britain. There's some acquiescing, right? In this period, where the power dynamic is so important, how critical was it for success for the monarchy to be acquiescent?
So you mean it's the kings themselves to agree, or for the people to agree? Because I think both of them. Yeah. Okay.
The king, who was used to having all this power, and I'm going to say basically do what he wanted, but obviously there's restrictions on that. But in other words, he's got to listen to somebody else, and he has to abide by these folks. And if he doesn't get his sweets.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
To a greater or lesser extent, kings engaged. I think one of the things that we have to understand is that when John's rejection of Magna Carta turned into a civil war, that was a very difficult civil war to properly end, even with royalist victory in battle. The tone had been set. Because essentially, whatever a king said after that, theoretically, no one can make the king obey the law. The king is appointed by God. I reject all of these things. I'm just not going to do them. If you're the king saying that, the practical reality that you're going to face is political crisis. And it's going to be pretty quick, as Henry III found in the earliest years of his majority in the early 1230s. At some level, kings had to acquiesce, because they weren't necessarily going to be deposed, but they were going to find themselves in pretty sticky political waters. Now, with Henry, it's interesting. Henry III, he said he acquiesced. He said he agreed. He said he understood the principles that were at stake here, but then flouted them repeatedly. And I think that what was going on there was, yes, I agree that this should apply in this circumstance and this circumstance, but there's this other circumstance that you haven't talked about yet, so I don't think it should apply here. And everyone else is going, oh no, there's spirit and letter, and we're talking about spirit and you're talking about letter. So it went backwards and forwards with Henry III, and it's one reason why we have such a big crisis in his reign in the 1250s. I think Edward I was the first king really who got that the nature of the political dialogue had substantially shifted.
Yes.
And that actually this could be empowering. So then it was not just about the king acquiescing in something that he didn't much. It was about the king leveraging something to his and the realm's advantage as a positive, as something that, if he worked together with Parliament and had really constructive dialogue, this was going to be amazing. So why wouldn't you do that? This is a really sensible thing to do. Where it broke down with Edward was, again, elements of, okay, but I still think my prerogative should be left untouched in these areas, and his subjects saying, oh no, actually, for us, now that we've established this, it's logical that we go to the next step. And you have that over and over again. What breaks down in the 14th century, I'm sure Richard will pick this up, is that you don't have so much kings who fundamentally know something about governing and are trying to do it, even if in Henry III's case they're often doing it badly. You have in Edward II and Richard II kings who throw it all out of the window and say, actually, don't want to do any of this. So then it's not just about acquiescing in political and structural developments. or rejecting them. It's actually about being a terrible king, and you would have been a terrible king whatever the circumstances. And then with Edward III being a king who, like Edward I, really gets it and realizes this can be empowering, not fettering, if you like.
Yeah, I think where Edward III is concerned, in a way, Robert, it's really straightforward. This is somebody who is highly intelligent, both cognitively and emotionally. And this broadcast is about leadership, among other things. And one of the characteristics of really good political leaders is their cognitive and emotional intelligence. And he understands really quickly, almost instinctively, that there are dimensions of power that actually they're not worth the candle. The amount of friction that they create is far in excess of the benefit that he as a king gains from having these rights. So one of the things within the context of Parliament and the development of a national system of taxation that continues even when war is not happening. And remember that taxation was originally all about funding war. And one of the things that happens in the 14th century is that taxation becomes normalized as a thing that happens even during periods of truce or peace. And that's a matter of negotiation and discussion. But Edward III recognizes that there's a whole pile of financial rights that he's got that are useless to him because they create so many problems and because they're so unproductive. And he can simply give all of those up and in return, within that process of negotiation and discussion, get something much more valuable, like the recognition that taxation is something that needs to be granted in the medium and longer term to enable really good financial planning and produce efficiencies and multiplications of effectiveness that otherwise would not be possible. And this is just politics. I was teaching one of my students, one of my undergraduate students last week, actually, and we were talking about the king's rights that the king gave up as part of this process. And I said, the problem with all of this is that in a way it assumes that there is a point at which politics doesn't constrain your rights. And as we all understand, and listeners will understand really well, politics always constrains. It doesn't matter what theoretically your rights are. There is only so much that a political community can tolerate and give. And even if technically you have the right to take X, the reality may be that circumstances mean that X minus one is all you can really take. And that's inescapable. So one of the phrases that I quite often use, which is maybe a bit trite, is politics will always find a way. And I can't believe that. Politics does have a tendency to find ways forward, but politics has a tendency to limit rights that are inappropriate or excessive, because you can only push people so far. And in a way, the reign of King John shows that, doesn't it? Caroline, as does much later the reign of Richard II. Edward II, a bit different. Edward II was really self-focused, irresponsible. In the case of Richard II, he just didn't really understand what he was supposed to be doing and the realities of his power and position and the limitations that were connected with that weren't really real limitations. They were nominal limitations, but he was so focused upon those outward forms rather than the essences. And John, so interesting because he was actually a highly intelligent person, but bad. And when we talk about bad King John, that is the right phrase, isn't it, Caroline?
Yeah, absolutely. Evil King John.
You're listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We're discussing the book Arise, England, 6 Kings and the Making of the English State, with authors Caroline Burt, who is a medieval historian and college lecturer at Pembroke College in Cambridge, Richard Partington and his warm beer, our senior tutors at St. John's College, Cambridge. This is their first publication. You try to do couple hundred years of history in one book is difficult. To try to push it into an hour or so podcast, I think, is also almost Sisyphean, but we're going to give it a shot. There are so many attempts, and it's a pejorative, revisionist history. Some people just get all in a knot. I don't really understand why it can be. I can understand why it's controversial sometimes. But in other ways, I think it's long overdue. We have that here in the United States. We're taking another look at Dwight Eisenhower. We're taking another look at Ulysses S. Grant, Woodrow Wilson. Some to revise up, some down.
Mm.
But are there in the six kings you detail? That's John, Henry III, Edward I, Edward II, Edward III, Richard II. Are any of them just irredeemable?
Yes. If we start with John, in personality terms, largely irredeemable. Yeah. We can have all the revisionism in the world about John, but in the end, somebody who behaves towards other people as cruelly as John did, and some of the acts of torture that he engaged in are detailed in the book. There's no coming back from that. I'm just going to nail my colours to the mast there. There is no coming back for King John. And the public largely agrees here in the UK. There was a survey a few years ago, and he's up there with serial killers and all sorts in terms of how people perceive him.
Kim Philby and the rest.
Yeah, no,
Popular
indeed,
mindset, yes.
indeed.
Richard.
Thank you. Edward, so people have attempted to, I wouldn't say rehabilitate Edward II, because I think everybody recognises that he was a really inadequate and problematic king. But there are people who have said or attempted to say that he was misunderstood, that he was unconventional, that
He had a difficult childhood.
that he was different, that he had a difficult childhood, all of this sort of stuff. But the reality is, if you look at what contemporaries say about John or about Edward II or about Richard II, you get a very consistent picture of people saying this person was cruel, irresponsible, and self-focused, or in the case of Richard, tyrannical, authoritarian. It's very difficult to swim against tides of that magnitude. And as historians, I think fundamentally we are engaged in an act of imagination. But we're engaged in an act of imagination because we're trying to imagine what it must have been like, what must have been going on, what must have been in the heads of political leaders and ordinary people in the past. But we have to do it within the context of the facts. And Pache postmodernism, there are things that we can be pretty sure about. And if you go back to the governmental record and you compare, say, Edward II with his son Edward III, in the case of Edward II, you can see that there was a lack of engagement with government, and that when he did engage, it was really all about settling petty scores and his own personal affairs. And if you look at somebody like Edward III, you can see that he was laser focused upon the public interest as well as the royal interest, and that he was simply immensely hardworking, reflective, intelligent in a way that you don't see with somebody like Edward II or Richard II.
Is it more surprising that Edward II and Richard II were so egregious? King John comes to the throne in 1199. His brother, Richard the Lionheart, reigned from 1189 to 1199. I think he was in England for 6 months of those 10 years.
Something like that. Yeah.
And so while John did have his father, Henry II, as someone to look to, Richard certainly didn't lay the path for John. But if you're Richard II or Edward II, your immediate predecessor is these amazing conquerors. And that's a separate question. These terrific leaders, kings, well-respected, feared, daunted. Why didn't those two do better if they had such terrific proximate role models?
The other thing you could, if you turn back to John, you could say, look, he's got Henry II as a father, who again is an absolute, and ironically, he's a very problematic personality, Henry II. Ironically, John is good at some of the elements of kingship, but it's his personality that lets him down. He had every good example of how to get the job done as king. What he wasn't was a very nice person. And he probably got that from his father and his brother and the whole family trait. It was a profoundly dysfunctional family. So you can see how the backdrop to John dynastically was both highly able and highly problematic personally. What about Edward II and Richard II?
I think, Robert, I would answer the question. Caroline's absolutely right, but I would answer the question in a slightly different way, which is to say that one of the things that we do as historians is we always want to psychoanalyze characters in the past. We want to get under their skin. And I think that historians do again and again with problematic historical figures. They say, oh, let's look at the childhood. Let's look at how dysfunctional it was. Let's look at all of the things that went badly wrong. Now, if you look at Edward III, here you have a king who, by the age of 15, really, but certainly by the age of 17, my goodness, he knew what he needed to do. He absolutely had it. And by any sensible yardstick, he had the most extraordinarily dysfunctional childhood. Grew up amidst the most terrible political crisis. And in the end, his dad was deposed by his mum and murdered by her lover. And yet he was completely well adjusted. Now, we might go beyond that and say, okay, maybe that's because he was brought up in other people's households. Maybe his wet nurse was a really nice woman and gave him the love that he needed when he was 2 and 3 years old. Maybe his tutor, Henry Beaumont, was a really sensible person who gave him good advice. But in the end, all of this seems to me a bit futile. And what I would really say is, look, this is just it's the accident of genetics, providence, the fates, whatever we want to call it. That if you have a system in which people assume positions of real political importance and power on the basis of factors other than suitability for the role, some of the time it's going to be an absolute disaster. It's just the law of averages.
And it happens with American presidents, even though we have a say in it, for lack of a better term. Caroline, Burt, did Edward II deserve to be deposed?
Yes.
Richard Partington, did Richard II deserve to be deposed?
He was asking for it. he was leaning towards the political community, poking his chin out and saying, go on, hit me right there. And they did, unsurprisingly.
So to elaborate, in both cases, what you're not dealing with a political community that is jealous of power, jealous of the king.
Correct.
Rivals to the king for power.
Correct.
Wanting somehow to engage in some sort of power grab. It's very simple with Edward II and Richard II to understand why they didn't stay on the throne. It's none of those things that we traditionally hear about. Kings and nobles must be at war with each other. No, most of the time they weren't. What happens when a king starts to plunder his subjects, when he starts to attack his own subjects, when he starts to kill his own subjects, is that strangely enough, somebody emerges who has absolutely nothing left to lose. Because in the case of Henry Bolingbroke, as we talked about him earlier, he'd been completely disinherited and banished from the realm. He had both of these things. In the case of Isabella and Mortimer, Edward II's wife and her lover, she'd been forced out and Mortimer had been banished. So these were people who were saying, well, nothing to lose, I'm just going to take action. And what then facilitates that is that everybody else says, yep, and it could be me next, so go right ahead.
Yeah.
That's how it happened.
Yeah, that is exactly right. That historians sometimes say, why didn't the king who was deposed, why didn't they build up a greater stock of support? Why didn't they ensure that all of the key offices were filled by people who were loyal to them? If you are a tyrant, if you are somebody who repeatedly breaks your word like Richard II did, nobody trusts you. Even the people who you've tried to keep close think it's going to be me next. And therefore, when somebody comes and says, we have to remove this tyrant, everybody else either sits on their hands or joins the revolution. And these are the universals of politics across geography and across time. That it's very unusual for somebody to be able to hold on to power if they genuinely represent a threat to pretty much everyone. Those people will be removed. One of the interesting questions, I think, for us as historians is how did people like Joseph Stalin manage it? In a way, how has Putin managed it in Russia? Because these are people who do, in their different ways, in the case of Stalin, did represent real threats. But there must have been enough about what they were able to provide, or in the case of Putin, are providing within the context of national politics that kept them there. Nobody is able to hold on to power simply by terror. To my mind,
you can do it for so long, but
you can do it for a short period of time, but it's always going to collapse.
There's lots of ways to go through your book, to read it for an interview. chronological is one way. And I want to make sure that we're not going to be able to give all the kings equal time. Not all of them deserve equal time, for better or worse. There are a couple of themes that I want to discuss that really, in your writing, made me understand. As the listeners may or may not know, my graduate degree at Indiana University is medieval history. It's late 14th, early 15th, but I don't read about it all the time. So this book was a marvelous trip down memory lane, if that's the right way to put it. Your writing made me remember things and look at things different. One of which, for this time period, 1199 to 1399, was foreign affairs, foreign policy. Please talk to the Leaders and Legends podcast audience about England and Scotland, England and Wales, England and France. England seemed to always be, you mentioned a few minutes ago, taxation for war. It was almost always going on, some conflict somewhere. How did the English state come to manage these wars?
Excellent question, Robert. Thank you. And I'm going to ask Caroline to talk in a few moments about the ideology that underpinned international relations, because it's a really interesting and in the 12th and 13th centuries, changing dimension of political motivation. So some of this is straightforward. Some of it is just about geopolitical rivalry. That if you're France and England, or England and Scotland, or England and Wales, you share borders. And there are jurisdictional questions, particularly at those borders, that create friction. And there is a natural desire on the part of national governments, so far as they exist, for superiority or even hegemony in those marcher areas. In the case of England and France, one of the things that's often falsely assumed about England is because England was fighting, in the case of some of the wars of Edward I and certainly the Hundred Years' War from 1337 onwards, because England was fighting within France most of the time, there's an assumption that somehow England was engaged in imperialism. And it's really important to recognise that the English were fighting to hold on to lands that they had inherited in France as French nobles, as great French lords. And this is another dimension of political reality, which is so many of the political elite within Europe in this time period were genuinely international. They were great lords in France and in England and in Scotland and in Ireland and perhaps in Spain or even in Italy. They had a whole series of landed responsibilities across national borders. So the English kings had lands in France because they'd been nobles in France before they became kings of England. And in the face of a French crown that was seeking to expand its practical jurisdiction to what we might now call its natural borders of the seas and the oceans and the great mountain ranges and the great rivers, the English found themselves under pressure in the same way that other great lords in France, the Dukes of Brittany, the Counts of Toulouse, later, the 15th century, the 16th century, the Dukes of Burgundy, in the way that other great landholders were being pushed back by a France that was expanding towards its natural borders and in the light of what it perceived to be its political inheritance, ultimately from the Roman Empire, but more immediately from the Frankish kings, Charlemagne in particular. So these were great, if you like, geopolitical forces. Within England, and in respect of its borders with Scotland and Wales, it's what I said earlier. It's about dimensions of control, but some of this is also was also about the role of individual lords, not the kings themselves, but the nobles beneath them, either side of the borders, who were seeking to augment their positions or steal a march, almost literally steal a march in some cases, on their local rivals. And unpicking that interplay between international politics, national politics, and local politics can be quite difficult. And in a way, the really helpful theme around the international stuff is ideology. And that's what I think Caroline should say a few words about.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that we have to understand about why so many of these wars took place in the 13th and 14th centuries in particular, not just between England and her neighbours or across the Channel between England and France, but between other realms and jurisdictions, is because the way in which people came to conceive of lordship and overlordship and sovereignty changed. And they changed with cues really from the Pope and from the Holy Roman Emperor about the way in which power should be expressed. And all of a sudden, kings started to copy what popes and Holy Roman emperors were doing and say, oh, my jurisdiction should be greater than anybody else's, and therefore your lordship doesn't really count. You have to answer to me. I have ultimate overlordship in, let's say, Wales, for example, or Scotland. So I will claim that sovereignty. And of course, in the case of somewhere like Scotland, the king is saying, no, I'm a king in my own right. Hang on a minute. The Scottish polity is not subservient to the English polity. Oh, no, actually, I'm your overlord, says the English king. And of course, it's all about pushing boundaries. And you might say this is all just in the service of naked kind of political ambition to conquer territory. I'm not naive, I certainly wouldn't say that that's absent. But I think a lot of the drivers are about how people have come to perceive themselves, their authority and their lordship in this period. And therefore, it's not an accident that you have so many wars focused on these questions of sovereignty and overlordship in this period compared with others. Now, you might say that in any period you have wars and somebody will always use some language to justify it. But I think something more is going on here. I think the language is driving behaviours. And I think this is a particularly conflictual period, not just, as I say, for England and her neighbours and antagonists, but for others as well. I think that general idea about how you see yourself really does affect things. And we see that in other periods of history as well. It's just that it's a different set of ideas that are at play.
And we see it in the present day, don't we? If you're Philip VI back in 14th century France, and you have a relatively marginal claim to the French throne, and the French political community is saying, you're the King of France. It's your responsibility to ensure that the French crown is the most respected crown in Europe. It's your responsibility to ensure that we have the maximum jurisdiction in the territories over which we claim overlordship. As a political leader, you don't have that much choice. If I were pushing this, I would say right now, Putin in Russia, he doesn't really have much choice but to be a nationalist. Now, I happen to think he wants to be a nationalist. He leans into that. It's part of his political credibility and his own internal political security. But no leader in Russia right now could come in and say, look, what we've been doing in Ukraine is wrong. They're just not going to survive because political perspectives in Russia will not tolerate that. In the same way that, right now, it seems to me it would be extremely difficult for a president in the United States to say, you know what, I think we should invite more Mexicans in. That is not something that is going to have any sort of political traction right now. And so leaders are often constrained by the realities of political circumstances. I have maybe a rather trite phrase for this, which I use when I'm teaching my students, which is weak power. Nominally, you're really powerful, but in fact, you don't have that many choices because of political circumstances.
And certainly in the United States, the argument over legal versus illegal immigration is one that continues to drive the public discourse. May I ask a question that I thought of when I was reading your book, and forgive me because it's not a scholarly question. Has the movie Braveheart been good for historians?
Caroline, would you like to answer or should I?
Why don't you start?
It's a really excellent question. So there are things that we can laugh at in Braveheart, Robert, as you will know, and listeners will know very well. We know that William Wallace
was not Australian.
Was not Australian. We know that he was not the father of
didn't have an Australian
Edward III.
He was not the father of Edward III. We know that he didn't wear a kilt or woad.
He was not poor.
We know by his very name, William Wallace, which in the Middle Ages meant the Welshman, that he was of mixed political inheritance. But actually, there is a sense in which I was going to say Mel Brooks's Braveheart. That's the ultimate Freudian slip.
That would be a very different.
I know. I think it would be a very different film, but that's a very naughty thing to say. So, in Mel Gibson's Braveheart, in a way, it connects actually quite truthfully with what Scottish political propaganda was saying about William Wallace in the 15th century. So although it tells an untrue story or a substantially untrue story, it's a story that substantially reflects what people were saying within 100 years of the events. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, it's actually quite historically truthful. And you're right in a way. There's no publicity. All publicity is good publicity. There's no such thing as bad publicity. In a way, we could say that about Braveheart and about the Middle Ages. The bit that worries me is, and it connects with what Caroline said earlier about historical actors' motivation. I don't like the idea that popular culture, the media, film, certain sorts of historical writing or historical novel writing, I don't like the sense that creates that everybody was in it for themselves and that everybody was ultimately corrupt and ambitious or incompetent, evil acting. Because the reality when you look at politics is that most political actors, most of the time, are trying to do the right thing. And that was as true in the Middle Ages as it is true now. And I think the problem with Braveheart is that it's a very cartoonish depiction of political motivation. Edward I undoubtedly had, forgive me, Caroline, you may correct me here, had political ambitions in relation to Scotland that we might disapprove of now on good grounds. But he wasn't evil. He was not that character.
The reason I bring it up, obviously, is the movie Braveheart. The meat of the movie takes place in the same time period covered by your book. Sterling Bridge, is that 1290,
1297?
Yeah, 1297. So Bannockburn, I think, is 1314. Is that right?
Correct.
So it's right in the heart, and you don't write a ton about all that. But Caroline, it seems to me that movies come out and their accuracy is, as we saw with the latest movie about Napoleon, which sent some people to rehab who do history for a living. We also have movies like in the United States, whether it's a great example of Saving Private Ryan, which clearly fueled a rise in not only remembering, but writing about World War II and what we call the greatest generation here. Braveheart, to you, is that a situation where Edward II's reputation is now set in stone, good or bad, as a homosexual, whiny, horrible king who just simply doesn't belong?
I don't think so. I think at the time, obviously, Braveheart had an impact. It was a big movie. I don't think that its legacy has been intractable, so crucial to people's view of the period and of particular actors within it. There are movies that we've all seen that have had kind of game-changing effects on how the general public sees a period. And that may well be the case with Saving Private Ryan, but I don't think that Braveheart had that effect.
I might disagree there, Caroline. I think that if you were in Scotland in the aftermath of the release of Braveheart. There were dimensions of public history that became very difficult to project without acknowledging William Wallace.
But I think I suppose my point is it was quite short term. I think that, and it plugged into certain trends and things that were happening in politics at that time. I don't think as a whole the movie's interpretation of lots of things has prevailed in terms of the public consciousness.
It's certainly, for the generation of students we now teach, Robert, Braveheart doesn't really mean anything.
Most of them haven't seen it.
One thing that's important to stress too is that there are films that can be quite inaccurate historically that can actually communicate the sense of what a period was like really well. And I actually think that the Michael Curtiz classic, The Adventures of Robin Hood, it actually reflects the medieval world remarkably well.
Greatest movie.
An amazing score, a wonderful film in so many ways. But that is not an unrecognizable medieval world.
It's not my all-time favorite movie. It's in the top 5, and thank God my kids have fallen in love with it because we watch it. We watch it multiple times a year. It's a brilliant movie. Claude Rains, Basil Rath. We could do a whole podcast about that. You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. We're discussing the book Arise, England, with its authors Caroline Burt and Richard Partington. The part of your book which struck me the most because of my own ignorance and because of the beautiful way you teased it, is the concept of justice and how the maladministration or the corrupt administration of justice, balanced by kings who wanted fairness in the judicial system, in the criminal justice system, if that's the right term.
It is the right term.
Yeah.
How did you, Caroline, we'll start with you. Why did you decide to make that such an important theme of your book? Because to me, that resonates as much in 2025 as it did in 1225.
It did it for itself because it underpins everything. Richard talked earlier about the creation of the common law. The common law was created really because lots of people were coming to Henry II after the civil strife of King Stephen's reign and saying, please sort out our disputes. He's taken my castle, I want it back, etc. And Henry needed, one, to be in France, so he couldn't be hearing all of these disputes himself, and two, to settle them, to show that his was going to be a government of law and order. So he said, okay, fine, if you have a dispute, you can buy a writ and you can have my justices hear this, and off we go. And that absolutely flew. It's hard to overstate the extent to which people said, wow, great idea, where do we sign?
Yes.
How can we get these writs? So much, we always joke about this, but there's 100 years later, there's a guy who turns up in a court with a writ of conspiracy. And the judge says to him, listen, Sonny Jim, your case has absolutely nothing to do with conspiracy. What are you doing here? And the guy says, why did you get this new writ? And the guy says, it's the new writ. So I got the new writ because it's the new writ. And it just gives you a sense of, there's this legal system, it's brilliant, I can access this. Where do I sign? Let me get more of this. And so there's this huge appetite coming from below for the justice that the king's judges and his jury system can hand out to people, for the disputes it can resolve, for the crime it can tackle. And of course, from that develops, if you have this concept of justice, you start to have a sense of, under these circumstances, for these very clear reasons, he's right and I'm wrong, or vice versa. Usually I'm right and he's wrong. It's where that whole sense of, okay, then in that case, what the king's doing to us isn't fair, it isn't right, it shouldn't be possible in taking our money without due process, comes from. So the whole thing, the whole period and the way in which the state develops is underpinned by this not only hunger for things that the state can offer that people find really useful in the form of justice in particular, whether that's criminal or civil, but also this concept of fairness and due process and right that invades everybody's thinking about how dialogue should happen about resources, and we talked earlier about that, resourcing war. So it wasn't difficult to bring it in because in many ways it set the tone, and it wasn't top down, it was both top down and bottom up. This is the thing, this wasn't a state imposed on people, this was a state that grew out of a very kind of, at times conflictual and at other times harmonious relationship between the king and his subjects. I don't know if Richard wants to pick the thread up there.
I think the only thing that I would add to that is that for ordinary people, the principal ways in which they experience government were legal ways. Even if it was the payment of taxation, for ordinary people, that would be mostly indirect rather than direct, because direct taxes mostly went on the relatively wealthy. Taxation, of course, was enforced through the legal system like everything else. Government was there in your locality, in your life, because you had access to the law. And it brought the king much closer to people. And by the time you get to the mid-14th century and the so-called quarter sessions of the Justices of the Peace, where royal courts are in each locality 4 times a year, and where charges are being presented through the grand jury and other presenting juries, and then cases are being tried by jury, you've got very large numbers of male householders actively involved in the process of government. I see this in the history of my own family. I have in the late 18th century an ancestor who was a maltster. He was in the brewing industry in Shropshire, and through the surviving legal records I can see him appearing on juries again and again. And this was a middle-ranking person, an ordinary person working in government. And so the law and government were absolutely hand in hand with one another, and it's how ordinary people primarily experienced rule.
This is an expansive question, and I don't mean it to be. So I'm sure that with your research and scholarship, you can narrow it down a little bit. How does England compare in this 200-year time, 1199 to 1399, to France, to the Holy Roman Empire, to Spain, to other places, even like I say, the Viking era, but Scandinavia? There's nation buildings going on in several places. How does England's efforts stack up against other countries?
If we go back to what I was talking about earlier with regard to lordship and overlordship and sovereignty, alongside those ideas, you have the development of all sorts of practical means of enforcing royal or lordly authority. And that's happening all across Europe. Government is being practically and theoretically empowered across Europe. The extent to which it can push that depends very much on the situation within that country, not just particular political circumstances, but wider questions. So if you look at England, one of the things that enables such massive change so quickly is because England was already pretty well centralized.
Yeah.
So the idea of a king whose authority expanded to the natural borders, if you like, of England and potentially even beyond was not something that was new in 1199. It wasn't really even something that was new in 1066. Now, you might, if you're in the north of England, not have experienced government as intensively before Henry II's reign as you would thereafter, but you still knew that he was your king. If you look at France in the same period, you've got a very different situation. You've got very powerful and very entrenched lordships in the form of the duchies. Richard referred to Brittany earlier, of course, the English king was Duke of Aquitaine. Those are very much harder for the French king to push against. So what you tend to see in somewhere like France is a lot of assertions of the French king's overall rights to kingship across, as Richard was saying, again, the natural boundaries of what would be France now. But you don't see the French king able to make that a practical reality in the same way as in England, for example. And that speaks to the very different circumstances that those kings inherited. Now, the Capetian kings of France made huge progress in this area. There's no doubt in terms of what they were trying to do and where they ended up. But they were still quite a significant way behind the English kings, which is evidenced, of course, by the fact that they're fighting, even in the 15th century, the English king, who's a duke in their own country. I mean, that tells you the difference in statuses here.
Yeah, I think that's true. Another dimension of this that's worth bearing in mind too is just distance. In a way, it's possible for England to be centralized in the way that it is because it's small.
Yeah.
And it was conquered. So already you had a unitary kingdom in the Anglo-Saxon kingdom that was then made even more unitary in a way by the Norman conquest. But realistically, if Edward III in the 1340s or 1350s, he can say to one of his sergeants at arms, one of his bodyguards on Wednesday morning, I want you to go and arrest this particular pirate in the town and port of Bristol, 150 miles away. Go and get them. The sergeants at arms will set off that morning. They'll be there that night. They'll arrest the pirate, and they'll have them back in London the following day. That's just not possible in France, where it takes 2 weeks to get somewhere.
Great point.
That's part of this as well.
Yeah.
And so in somewhere like France or somewhere like Scotland, it's a combination of geography and inaccessibility and distance, but it's also, as Caroline has already said, about the realities of local lordship. And what tends to happen in those countries, and I think the work of Alice Taylor on Scotland is really helpful here, is that once upon a time, we'd have said actually kingship is less effective, government is less effective, the state is less effective because it can't reach directly in the way the English king can. But now we would say, for example, in Scotland, what it does is it co-opts lordship in the localities really effectively. And that's a different way of delivering government. But it's still government. It's still a kind of statehood. And I'm very much attracted to that way of thinking.
There is a book out, I believe it's already out, by Dan Jones, which I've read, and I believe he's going to come on the podcast. He emailed me and was very gracious. And the book is called Henry V, which is so outside of your time period. He becomes king in 1413?
Correct.
The astonishing triumph of England's greatest warrior king. In your book, you detail the exploits of Edward I and Edward III. So here's your chance to tell Mr. Jones who is actually the greatest warrior king of England.
And Mr. Jones was actually taught by both of us. So I'm going to discount Edward I from this battle immediately, because Edward I is great as a warrior. He really is a fantastic warrior, but he's not in the same league as Edward III, Henry V. Richard is the great expert on Edward III. So I'm actually going to throw now the hot potato to him on Edward III.
I think it's really difficult to make comparisons. One thing I'd say about Henry V is that in many ways, what he seeks to do in his government is a very active and conscious emulation of Edward III. To be fair, Edward III consciously emulated Edward I.
Yep.
They look to their ancestors, their predecessors, and they seek to draw lessons because they're intelligent people, these three.
Or if you're Henry VIII, you just...
Henry VIII, you seek to draw lessons and fail to. But with Henry V and Edward III, it's very difficult to draw comparison, primarily because the lengths of the reigns are very different. The political circumstances are very different. Had Edward III died of dysentery in 1357, we would say there is no contest. Partly because he lived much longer, and partly because his reign then saw foreign policy setbacks after 1369, we might say he wasn't able to deliver as much as Henry V. One of the things about Henry V that is often said is he left his son an impossible political inheritance. I don't actually think that is true at all. I think we need to think in quite sophisticated ways about what's politically possible and what's politically impossible. I think what we would say about both of these kings is that during their active lifetimes, anyone coming up against them assumed they were going to lose. And that seems to me to be, and they were correct. And that seems to me to be actually quite a helpful way of thinking about it. They were military commanders of brilliance and political leaders of real assuredness. And they had that combination of charisma, excellent decision-making, boldness and bravery, strategic vision, political intelligence. That's why they dominated.
Did a history show here in Indiana about 10 or 12 years ago. There was a series of history shows with my thesis director, who his PhD was on the House of Godwinson. He was my medieval history professor, and a incomparable philanthropist named P.E. McAllister, who thinks the book, How the Scots Invented the Modern World, he thought it was too modest. I'll just give you a hint as what a proud Scotsman he was. And one of the shows we did was what are the most impactful premature deaths in history. And one of my 5 or 6 was the death of the Black Prince in 1376.
Correct.
1376.
Yeah.
Speaking of great warriors, he wins the Battle of Poitiers in 1356.
Yeah.
How did the death of the Black Prince, the son of Edward III, father of Richard II, Richard comes to the throne when I think he's 10. How did the death of the Black Prince change everything?
Oh, not just, we should bear in mind also not just the death of the Black Prince, but the death of his eldest son, Edward, which left, of course, Richard to become king ultimately. Everybody had been expecting that the Black Prince would become king. Everybody thought he was marvellous. Everybody thought this was going to be an Edward III Mark II.
Edward III, but even better.
It was a done deal. Yeah. And then all of a sudden, he's gone. John of Gaunt is left as the king's essentially key son to try and pick up all the pieces here and look after the young would-be Richard II, and then he was Richard II. John of Gaunt was absolutely left bereft by the fact that his brother had died. His brother was his greatest hero. He'd grown up in his brother's household. He'd learnt to fight with his brother. It's hard to overemphasize the extent to which not just the death, but the illness of the Black Prince and the absence from action in Aquitaine latterly and then in the political fora within England really affected things disastrously. It's very interesting to think what England would have looked like had he not become ill. Probably, I think one of the theories is that it was dysentery contracted at the Battle of Najera
Or
in Spain.
on that campaign.
On that, and would have been so completely different. And John of Gaunt, his younger brother, who had to hold everything together on Edward III's behalf, had many of the best traits of his father and brother and some really bad traits in terms of how he handled people, how he dealt with people, how he conceived of himself. And that made everything 10 times worse again. Richard, do you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, if you think about the struggles that John of Gaunt had around his personality and character, you think of the things that people said about Edward III and also said about the Black Prince, how gracious they were, how open they were, how approachable they were. There's an extraordinary surviving document in the amazing National Archive of England and Wales and Scotland, of course, since the Act of Union, in which the Black Prince's retinue, his military retinue at Northampton in 1360 is listed. It's pretty much the entire nobility of England. This is 16 years before his death and 17 years before the end of his father's reign. He was regarded as an absolute giant by contemporaries.
I have 3 more questions before we get to the final 5 questions that all of our guests answer. And they're all out there. You'll hopefully find them fun. Very quickly, see if you can give a 1 or 1 sentence answer, not a 1-word answer. Your period covers 1199 to 1399, King John through the reign of Richard II. Who's the most underrated person of this time period?
I think in lots of ways, Edward I. I think he did originally have a strong press, and then it went against him a little bit, and there's been a lot of kind of criticism of Edward I. I think there's not been enough historiography that's emphasized the visionary nature of a lot of what he was doing as king.
I agree.
Who was the most overrated person during your time period?
By some historians, Richard II. The idea that he was somehow a visionary who fought early modern autocratic government. Unfortunately, I think he was not very bright. He really didn't get it. And he was a hugely problematic king.
Caroline?
I would agree with that.
No discussion of your time period can. I've saved this for last for, I think, pretty obvious reasons. One of the best books I ever read by Philip Ziegler called The Black Death. You detail in scholarly and depressing ways what the plague meant, the Black Death meant in the 14th century, specifically to England. Is it possible to overstate the disruption it had on English society?
No, think medieval COVID. This is a disease that killed maybe as much as 50% of the population. And of course, there were no vaccines, and it kept coming back in waves like COVID. It kept slightly mutating and killing more people. And it created economic disaster. In the 1370s, one of the reasons why the political climate gets so testy in England is because of the economic malaise that is the aftermath of the pandemic, which again, we've seen in modern times as well. And I was struck reading about and writing about the politics of the late 1370s and the suspiciousness that people had of authority and the anger towards elites and the effects on people's quality of life. I was really struck by the parallels with what has happened in the last few years, especially since I wrote bits of this during COVID itself.
I wrote bits of it with COVID.
That must be the depressing parts of the...
But Caroline is absolutely right. In a way, it's the thing about the Black Death, it's 1348 when it first breaks out. Because there is a period of economic boom in the aftermath, actually. It's purely coincidental. The effects of the Black Death are delayed, but when they fully kick in with the decline in the economy in the 1370s, it's horrible.
But we also saw that a little bit with COVID, because certainly here in the UK, nobody went anywhere. So everyone had lots of money in the bank and started spending money in the immediate aftermath of COVID. And then all of a sudden, bang.
And they say that a lot about the United States in World War II. How World War II, quote unquote, cured the Depression is because everybody had this money and they couldn't spend it. And now all of a sudden in 1946, things changed.
Yeah.
Not to mention the fueling of the rampant anti-Semitism as a result of the Black Death. I've read a couple articles about that the merchants were blamed and they made their logical leaps from one way to the other.
Yeah.
We have reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Ms. Burt, Mr. Partington, are you ready?
Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
We'll do a ladies first on all these. What was your first job?
Oh, I worked in a bakery selling cakes and bread to people, and I was paid £1.91 an hour, which was not very much money even then. And I hated it. People were very rude.
Richard?
My first job for which I was paid, was working on a building site.
What was your first concert?
I went to see the Cranberries at the GMEX in Manchester, which is my home city. Shout out to anyone who's been to Manchester or is a Mancunian in the US. Hello. You can't hear it, but I am a Manc.
And for me, I went to lots of classical music concerts in my youth, which I remember really vividly. My first popular music event, I remember equally vividly. It was in 1992. It was the Midsummer Blues, the American Music Festival, the Crystal Palace Bowl in London. And I saw for the first time in my life the great Buddy Guy, and it was a life-changing experience.
Or either
in Chicago.
And then you met Buddy in Chicago many years later.
I've got a photo of me with Buddy in Chicago.
Really?
Guy, yeah, he turned up at his Legends Club and I was there.
I think the all-time winner, champion answer is Helen Rappaport. I believe it was Helen Rappaport. She saw the Beatles in a pub in 1962.
Yeah, hands down.
Yeah, that's definitely going to be a winner.
We can't beat that.
I almost retired the question actually after that, but your answers are wonderful. Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Any book,
including Arise England.
That's a very
Arise England.
that's a very difficult question.
So I think I would choose Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, which I just love for so many reasons.
And I'm torn between the great 14th century alliterative poem, Gawain and the Green Knight, and Dorothy L. Sayers' Gaudy Night.
We'll give you a mulligan. We'll give you both. Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I don't want anything medieval because there weren't toilets properly and sanitation and heating and stuff like that.
Oh no, that's a myth. There really was.
Yeah, but
sanitation
not
toilets.
to my standards. No.
There's sanitation.
I don't want to witness the revolting peasants of 1381. Oh, that's a really difficult one.
Any historical event
from any time period.
I think I am going to predictably go for something in the period that...
We should note, though, very quickly, Richard, that the look on Professor Burt's face is one of abject pain. But please go ahead with your answer.
That is true. Now, I would really like to have been a fly on the wall in the Tower of London in very late November, early December 1340, when Edward III, unannounced, arrived home in the middle of the night from Flanders and began the political purge that cemented his rule and opened up the possibilities for English victory in the 1340s. I'd love to have been there watching what was going on.
Professor Burt?
I think I would like to have witnessed people's reaction for myself to the end of the Second World War, probably up in my hometown, Manchester, because I vividly remember the stories my mum told me about it. She was born in 1930, and I would just like to have seen what that felt like. So
Love it. Number 5, last question. If you could
these are
have,
really hard.
they're certainly not harder than the questions you asked in your classes. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record, just to chat, whom would you choose?
Paul McCartney.
A popular answer.
Or possibly Ringo Starr. Either would do.
I like Sir Paul's catalog a tad bit better. My kids and I actually saw him on Bastille Day, July 14th, 2013, here in Indianapolis. He's terrific.
He's one of the absolute greats live, I think. Him, Stevie Wonder.
And he's probably the most famous person in the world, don't you think? He's probably the most famous person in the world, other than the Pope and the President.
Yeah, probably.
If you could bring her back from the dead, Queen Elizabeth II, probably.
Now, Professor Burt, you don't allow answers like that to your questions. Living today.
Oh. Someone who's alive today.
While Caroline is thinking, I'm going to tell you why Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, because I'm really interested in that extraordinary alchemy, that providential alchemy, cultural and personal, that led to an amazing explosion of music and change in a regional part of England in the late 1950s, early 1960s. Very interested in the long 1950s, and those people were absolutely part of that.
The second British invasion?
Yeah.
I was born in 1967, so I don't know how old I am compared to the two of you, and it's not polite to ask, especially.
You're 2 years older than me, so we were in the same place.
But I was born at the tail end, but I had older brothers and sisters when every song they played seemed to be from England or from Britain, and it's a phenomenal time period. And to have to live in the same era as Paul McCartney is a true gift, for sure. Dr. Burt?
Come on, Caroline.
Oh, I'm probably going to say somebody like Tony Blair. I think I'd be interested to pick his brains, but I've read his autobiography, so I don't know. I'm really struggling. I'm so sorry. They're all dead. That's the problem. And you said I could resurrect them, so that's really tough.
My medieval history professor told me that everything that has happened after 1485 are mere footnotes. So your point is well taken. You have been listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast, sponsored by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Our guests today, Caroline Burt and Richard Partington, we have discussed their book, Arise, England, 6 Kings and the Making of the English State. It was an education reading your book. It was an adventure, and it was fun. Thank you both very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having us.
It was our absolute pleasure, Robert. Thank you so much.
And thanks, everyone, for listening.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.